Somewhere in the Persian Gulf, right now, a tanker is sitting still. It left port 3 days ago. It's loaded. The crew is on board. The captain has been on the radio every few hours, checking, waiting, asking the same question everyone else is asking: is it safe to move? And nobody has a good answer for him. Because the strait ahead, that narrow cut of water between Iran and the coast of Oman, the one that leads to the open ocean and every port and refinery beyond it, that strait is, for all practical purposes, closed. 200 ships are anchored right now in open waters off the coasts of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Not moving. Just sitting there, loaded with oil and gas and cargo, waiting. Insurance companies have quintupled their rates. Qatar has declared force majeure on its gas shipments. Saudi Arabia's largest export terminal has been struck by drones. And oil prices, already climbing, jumped 12% in the span of a single week. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a war game. This is March 2026. And what's happening right now feels, to anyone who knows their history, like something that already happened once before. The question is, did we ever actually learn anything from it? Let's go back. All the way back. September 22, 1980. A cool autumn morning in the border city of Khorramshahr, in southwest Iran. The city sits at the very edge of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spill together and run down to the Persian Gulf. It's a city of docks and refineries and fishermen's families. And that morning, without declaration, without warning, Iraqi tanks rolled across the border. Saddam Hussein had made a calculation. Iran, he believed, was weak. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 had turned the country upside down. The Shah was gone, exiled and dying. The new government of Ayatollah Khomeini was chaotic, internally fractured, diplomatically isolated. Half the Iranian officer corps had been purged or imprisoned. Saddam saw a window, and he jumped through it. His goal was control of the Shatt al-Arab waterway and access to the Persian Gulf. But within weeks, the war that was supposed to last a few days had bogged down into something far uglier. Iranian volunteers, fueled by revolutionary fire, flooded to the front. They were willing to die in ways that surprised even their enemies. And so the fighting didn't end in weeks. It went on for months. Then years. 8 years, in the end. 8 years of trench warfare, chemical weapons, suicide charges across minefields, and a death toll that some historians put as high as 1 million people. But here's the part that most people don't know. Here's the part that connects to everything happening today. The war didn't stay on land. By 1981, both sides had figured out something important. If you can't break your enemy on the battlefield, maybe you can bleed them economically. And the economic lifeblood of both Iran and Iraq, and really of the entire Gulf region, was oil. Oil that had to travel by ship, through the Persian Gulf, through the narrow Strait of Hormuz at the bottom of the Gulf, and out into the world. Iraq began it. Iraqi aircraft started attacking ships that were heading to or from Iranian ports. The logic was simple and brutal: if Iranian oil can't get to market, Iran can't pay for the war. No money, no bullets, no soldiers. And so, cargo ships from Greece, Liberia, Japan, Panama, Cyprus, nations that had nothing to do with the conflict, began getting hit by Iraqi Exocet missiles. Ships caught fire. Ships sank. Sailors died. Iran, once it had absorbed those first blows, hit back. Not immediately, Not at first, but by May of 1984, when Iraq sharply escalated its attacks on Iranian oil infrastructure, Iran began striking ships trading with Iraq and Iraq's Gulf state allies. Kuwait was a particular target, because Kuwait had been quietly financing Iraq's war effort, providing loans and tanker berths and all the quiet support that makes a war machine run. So now it wasn't just one side. It was both sides. Hundreds of ships from dozens of countries sailing through a war zone, hoping they weren't going to be the next one to get hit. The international shipping world gave it a name, the Tanker War. Between 1981 and 1988, over 450 merchant vessels were attacked in the Persian Gulf. 60 were sunk or permanently lost. Tens of thousands of sailors from countries all over the world were caught in someone else's conflict. And the world that depended on that oil, which was most of the world, was watching very nervously. To understand what was at stake, you have to understand the geography of the place. Look at a map of the Persian Gulf. It's shaped a bit like a long, narrow funnel. The wide end is up north, near Kuwait and Iraq. The narrow end tapers down to the south, and at the very bottom, the water squeezes through a gap between the coast of Iran and the tip of the Omani Peninsula. That gap is the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the strait is only 21 nautical miles wide. That's about 40 kilometers. The actual shipping lanes, the lanes that giant supertankers have to use because they're so deep, those are only 2 miles wide in each direction, with a 2-mile buffer zone in between. You could drive across that distance in a few minutes. These massive vessels, some of them a quarter-mile long, carrying millions of barrels of crude oil, are threading a needle. In the 1980s, 60% of the world's oil passed through that needle. Today, after decades of pipelines and alternative routes being built, it's still around 20%, roughly 21 million barrels every single day. 20% of the global oil supply. If that strait closes, it doesn't just mean inconvenience. It means oil prices spike. It means economies slow. It means heating oil and gasoline and jet fuel and plastics and fertilizer and everything else that comes from crude oil suddenly becomes more expensive for everyone everywhere. The geography hasn't changed. It can't change. That's what makes this strait so uniquely powerful, and so uniquely dangerous. Back in the 1980s, the tanker captains learned to read the Gulf in new ways. They learned to keep radios on at all hours. They learned that a plane appearing on radar in a certain direction at a certain time of day was probably Iraqi, and that an Iraqi plane might be looking for an Iranian target, but that the pilot might not be entirely sure which ship was which. They learned to look for the shimmer of a speedboat moving at night, coming in low and fast. Iranian speedboats, boammers, they called them, fast fiberglass craft bristling with rockets and heavy machine guns, could swarm a tanker before you even had time to call for help. The sailors aboard these ships were not soldiers. They were merchant mariners. A Greek deck officer. A Filipino engineer. A Norwegian captain who'd spent 30 years at sea and never expected to find himself in the middle of an actual war. These people didn't sign up for combat. But the war didn't care about that distinction. Missiles don't read crew lists. And then in the spring of 1987, something shifted. Kuwait, which had been quietly absorbing Iranian attacks on its tanker fleet, made a move that would drag the world's superpower directly into the Gulf. Kuwait approached both the Soviet Union and the United States, offering to let one of them reflag Kuwaiti oil tankers, to put one of their flags on the ships, which would effectively mean that any attack on those ships would be an attack on that nation. Kuwait was playing the two superpowers off each other, hoping one of them would bite. The Reagan administration looked at the situation and understood the stakes immediately. Soviet ships were already operating in the Gulf. If the Soviets stepped in to protect Kuwaiti oil, they'd have a permanent foothold in one of the most strategically vital waterways on Earth. So on March 7, 1987, the United States agreed to reflag 11 Kuwaiti tankers. The U.S. Navy would escort them through the strait. The operation was given a name, Operation Earnest Will. It was the largest convoy operation the U.S. Navy had conducted since World War II. The first convoy left the Gulf of Oman on July 22, 1987. Two massive Kuwaiti supertankers, now flying American flags, now renamed with American names, sailed alongside 3 U.S. Navy warships. The sight of it was something. These tankers were gigantic, some of them over 400,000 tons, and they moved through the Gulf with the deliberate, almost ponderous weight of something that was not built for speed. And beside them, the warships, lean, gray, armed, keeping watch. The convoy commanders knew the Iranians would be watching. They'd slowed the convoy the night before because intelligence reports mentioned unusual Iranian naval activity near a small island called Farsi, right in the middle of the shipping channel the deep draft tankers would be forced to use. U.S. surveillance aircraft watched Iranian speedboats maneuvering in that channel in the darkness, running without lights. And when the convoy steamed through the next morning, the lead tanker, the newly renamed Bridgeton, was suddenly rocked by an explosion at 6:55 in the morning. An Iranian mine. A Soviet-designed M08 contact mine, the kind that just floats there in the water, waiting for a hull. It tore a 50-square-meter hole in the Bridgeton's side. The sailors on the bridge felt the shock wave roll aft, felt it knock them off their feet. The tanker was so large that it stayed afloat. A smaller ship would have sunk immediately, but the damage was done. The very first convoy of Operation Earnest Will had hit a mine. The revelation was stunning. Because all those sleek U.S. Navy destroyers and frigates running alongside the tankers, they drew less water than the tanker did. They were in more danger from the mines than the ship they were supposed to protect. For a few surreal minutes, the situation reversed itself entirely. The massive civilian tanker Bridgeton, trailing oil from a hole in its hull, led the convoy, and the U.S. Navy warships tucked in behind it, using it as a shield. 2 months after that first mine strike, on the night of September 21, 1987, a small Iranian ship was spotted in the middle of the Gulf moving without lights. 3 U.S. Army Special Operations helicopters, small, fast, nimble little MH-6 Little Birds, moved in to investigate. Through night vision goggles, the pilots watched as men on the ship's deck pulled a tarpaulin back from what looked like a cluster of oil drums on carts and began pushing them, one by one, over the side of the ship. One of the pilots keyed his radio and said, calmly, "They're pushing shopping carts over the side now." The mines were splashing into the Gulf in the darkness, not far from the U.S. Navy's base in Bahrain. The Iranian ship was called the Iran AJR. Rear Admiral Harold Burnson was on his command ship miles away, listening to the radio report. He turned to his mine warfare expert and asked what they were doing. "Sir, I think they're laying mines." Burnson didn't hesitate. "Take them," he said. The helicopters made their runs, firing rockets into the deck, the bridge, the engine room. The next morning, Navy SEALs fast-roped onto the smoldering ship and captured it. The mines still on board were recovered and transferred to a U.S. Navy vessel. Intelligence analysis confirmed what everyone suspected: the mines had serial numbers sequential to those already swept from Kuwaiti waters. Iran had been systematically mining the routes used by the convoys. But none of these moments, not the mine striking Bridgeton, not the discovery of the Iran AJR, none of them shocked the public the way the spring of 1987 already had. Go back to May 17, 3 months before that first convoy, before Operation Earnest Will had even begun. It was evening in the Gulf, the sky still faintly orange at the edges, and USS Stark, a U.S. Navy guided missile frigate, was on patrol. The crew was not on high alert. The area they were patrolling was not near any active combat zone. A radar track appeared in the distance, and the officer of the deck noted it, an Iraqi Mirage F-1, heading in their general direction. But Iraqi aircraft flew in the area all the time. Nobody was particularly alarmed. The pilot locked his radar onto the Stark and fired 2 Exocet anti-ship missiles. The first one hit the port side of the ship and didn't explode, but the unspent rocket fuel ignited, and the fire began to spread almost immediately through crew berthing spaces where sailors were sleeping. The second Exocet hit seconds later, this one detonating. When the smoke cleared, 37 American sailors were dead. 21 more were wounded. The ship barely survived. Saddam Hussein apologized. He said the pilot had made a mistake, he'd confused the Stark for an Iranian vessel. Whether that was true or not, the apology was accepted, and the U.S. continued to lean toward Iraq in the war. But the message that the incident sent was unmistakable: in this war, in this strait, everyone is at risk. Even the world's greatest navy. Even a warship, not a tanker. Even an ally's aircraft could turn the wrong direction and change everything. 37 names. 37 families. For what? For someone else's war. The loss had weight. The tanker war kept escalating through 1987 and into early 1988. More mines were laid, more ships were struck. Iran fired Chinese-made Silkworm missiles from shore batteries, targeting Kuwaiti ports. Speedboats swarmed tankers in the dark. The U.S. military expanded its presence and its operations, deploying mobile sea bases, converted oil barges, essentially, as forward platforms for special operations forces in the middle of the Gulf. U.S. helicopters sank Iranian patrol boats, seized Iranian ships, and slowly, methodically, pushed back. Then on April 14, 1988, USS Samuel B. Roberts was on routine patrol in the Central Gulf. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the frigate hit an Iranian mine. The explosion blew a hole in the hull big enough to walk through. 10 sailors were injured, some severely. The ship nearly had to be abandoned. The Reagan administration had been patient. But this, they decided, was enough. 4 days later, on April 18, 1988, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Praying Mantis. In a single day, 8 hours, start to finish, American forces destroyed 2 Iranian oil platforms being used as military staging posts, sank 1 Iranian frigate, sank several speedboats, and crippled a second Iranian frigate. It was the largest surface naval battle the U.S. had fought since World War II, and Iran's naval capacity was effectively cut in half in a single afternoon. The war at sea was winding down. But the Gulf still had one more tragedy to give before it was over. July 3, 1988. The USS Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser running in the Gulf, was engaged in a skirmish with Iranian speedboats when its crew detected an aircraft taking off from Bandar Abbas Airport and climbing toward them. The ship's sophisticated Aegis radar system tracked the plane. The operators, already jumpy from the firefight, misidentified the radar signature. They thought it was an Iranian F-14 fighter jet descending in a hostile attack profile. They had about 3 minutes to decide. They fired 2 surface-to-air missiles. The plane was Iran Air Flight 655, an Airbus A300 commercial airliner. 290 people on board. Families. Children. The aircraft came apart over the Strait of Hormuz. All 290 people died. It was not combat. It was a terrible, catastrophic mistake. And it was the kind of mistake that happens in a war zone that is also an international shipping lane, that is also a commercial flight corridor, when everything is too close together, when the pressure is too high, when the margin for error disappears. The Vincennes crew acted in what they believed was self-defense. The passengers on that Airbus had no idea they were anywhere near a war. The ceasefire between Iran and Iraq came the following month. August 1988. The guns stopped. The war was over. And the world took a breath. But the strait was still there. Exactly where it had always been. Here's what's easy to forget in the years that followed. The tanker war didn't end because someone won. It ended because everyone was exhausted. Iran accepted the ceasefire not because it had been defeated militarily, but because the economic and human cost had become unbearable. Iraq was broke, in debt to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Thousands of merchant sailors had been terrorized, dozens of ships destroyed. Insurance rates had made shipping through the Gulf so expensive that the entire global oil market had felt it. The lesson seemed obvious: threatening the Strait of Hormuz is threatening the world economy. And the world will respond. But there was a quieter lesson underneath that one. A more unsettling one. The lesson that the tanker war actually proved wasn't just that threats to the strait would bring intervention. It was that the strait can be threatened. That a mid-sized military power with determination, speedboats, mines, and missiles can disrupt global energy flows for years. That even the United States Navy, the most powerful in the world, cannot simply sweep the problem away with force. It took 14 months of convoy operations, special operations missions, and eventually direct combat before the pressure eased. And even then, it was diplomacy, exhaustion, not military dominance, that finally closed the chapter. The decades after the tanker war were not peaceful. They just weren't quite as visible. Iran never stopped believing that the strait was its leverage. It was the one card in its hand that no one could take away. And as the years passed, Tehran became increasingly skilled at using that card without fully playing it, threatening, harassing, probing, testing the edges of what the world would tolerate. In 2019, something happened that should have been a loud, unmistakable warning. On the night of September 14th of that year, 25 drones and cruise missiles flew low across the desert and struck the Saudi Aramco processing facility at Abqaiq, the single largest oil processing complex on Earth, the place where roughly 5% of the world's entire daily oil supply gets treated and prepared for export. The attack was surgical, precise, and devastating. Within hours, Saudi Arabia had shut down half its oil production. 5 to 7% of global supply, gone overnight. The Houthis in Yemen claimed responsibility. But the weapons, the flight paths, the precision, the specific targets, pointed to Iran. The US and Saudi Arabia said Iran had provided the weapons and the planning, if not the direct order to fire. The world was stunned for about 2 weeks. Oil prices spiked. Then, Saudi Aramco restored production faster than anyone expected, the spike receded, and the world largely moved on. But what Abqaiq had demonstrated, quietly, ominously, was that the geography of the new Gulf War was not just the water. It was the infrastructure, The refineries, the pipelines, the loading terminals, the LNG plants. All of it was now within range of cheap, accurate, drone technology. The barrier between the battlefield and the energy supply had evaporated. You didn't need a navy anymore. You needed a drone. Then came October 7, 2023, and everything in the region changed shape. Within weeks of Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's response in Gaza, the Houthi movement in Yemen, long-armed and directed by Tehran, began firing missiles and drones toward Israeli territory. And then, starting in November 2023, they did something else. They started attacking ships. Not just Israeli ships. Any ship they decided was connected to Israel or the country supporting it, which in practice meant almost anything that moved through the Red Sea. The Galaxy Leader, a Japanese-owned car carrier, was seized by Houthi speedboats in November 2023, its crew taken hostage in a helicopter raid that looked almost identical to Iranian operations in the 1980s. Over the next year and more, the Houthis struck over 100 vessels. They used anti-ship missiles, one-way attack drones, drone boats packed with explosives, and sometimes a combination of all three at once. A British-owned oil tanker burned for weeks in the Red Sea. The wreck of one vessel still sits there today. The response from shipping companies was simple math. Going through the Red Sea now cost you the risk of a missile strike. Going around the Cape of Good Hope instead, around the southern tip of Africa, added roughly 3,500 nautical miles to the journey, more than a week of extra sailing time, and over $1 million in additional fuel and crew costs. By February of 2024, container ship traffic through the Suez Canal had fallen by 82%. Shipping companies chose the long way around. The world adjusted. Prices for goods crept up. Inflation, already stubborn, got a quiet push. Most consumers never knew exactly why. In April 2024, Iran itself made a direct move. IRGC Special Forces rappelled from a helicopter onto the deck of MSC Ares, a container ship operated by the Mediterranean Shipping Company, in international waters near the Strait of Hormuz. 17 crew members were detained. The ship was held for months. Iran said it was seized for violating maritime law. Everyone understood the real message: we can take your ships whenever we choose. The echoes of the 1980s were getting louder. For a while in 2025, things quieted. A ceasefire in Gaza led the Houthis to pause their attacks on shipping in October 2025. The major carriers cautiously began returning to Red Sea routes. It felt, briefly, like the pressure had released. But the underlying tensions had not gone anywhere. Iran's nuclear program, its proxy networks across the region, its relationship with Russia and China, the accumulating weight of years of sanctions, all of it had been building pressure without release. And then, in late February of 2026, U.S. and Israeli military forces launched strikes on Iran. The strikes hit military infrastructure, weapons programs, command centers. And they killed Iran's supreme leader. What came next was not slow. It was not measured. It was immediate. Within hours, Iranian forces began attacking ships in and near the Strait of Hormuz. An IRGC senior commander spoke on state media and his words were cold and direct: "The strait is closed. If anyone tries to pass, the heroes of the Revolutionary Guard will set those ships ablaze. We will not allow a single drop of oil to leave the region." The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide, 2-mile shipping lanes, 20% of the world's oil, was closed. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Not in abstract policy terms. Think about it practically. A tanker captain sitting at anchor somewhere off the coast of Qatar right now has a ship full of crude oil, a crew of 20 or 30 people from various countries, and nowhere to go. The channel ahead of him is contested. His insurance provider has either quintupled his rates or stopped offering coverage entirely. His company's operations center is calling him every few hours. His crew is asking questions he can't answer. He has food for perhaps 3 more weeks. The longer he sits, the more everything costs: fuel for the generators, fresh water, food. And somewhere out there, a small, fast drone boat could be running on the surface toward him in the darkness right now, and he'd have about 30 seconds of warning. He's not a soldier. Neither are his crew. But they are, at this moment, on the front line of something much larger than any of them. Meanwhile, 200 ships are in the same situation as his. Qatar has shut down its LNG production, force majeure, they declared, because the facilities were attacked. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura terminal, the largest oil export hub on Earth, was struck by drones. Iraq is cutting production because it's run out of storage, the tankers can't move, so the oil has nowhere to go, so the wells have to slow down. In Europe, natural gas prices jumped 50% in a single week. In Asia, refineries are scrambling to find replacement crude from America or Russia or wherever they can get it. Goldman Sachs raised its oil price forecast. Oil prices climbed 12% in a week. And that's without a single well being permanently destroyed. Just the disruption of shipping, just the threat to the transit route, is enough to send the global economy sideways. The U.S. Navy, for its part, is doing something that would have felt very familiar to an admiral from 1987. President Trump has pledged to provide insurance guarantees and naval escorts to ships trying to transit. A U.S. submarine struck an Iranian warship off the coast of Sri Lanka. The language coming out of Washington is almost identical to the language from the Reagan administration 38 years ago: we will ensure the free flow of energy. We will protect shipping. We will not allow this strait to be held hostage. Operation Earnest Will is playing again. Different actors, different weapons, but the same stage, the same script, almost the same lines. But here's where it gets complicated. And this is the part that historians of the tanker war have been saying quietly for years, and that perhaps deserves saying more loudly. In 1987 and 1988, the U.S. Navy fought a campaign in the Gulf that lasted 14 months. It involved dozens of ships, thousands of sailors, multiple combat engagements, the death of American service members, and the tragic shooting down of a civilian airliner. At the end of it, the war between Iran and Iraq ended, not because the U.S. Navy defeated Iran, but because both Iran and Iraq were exhausted and the UN ceasefire resolution gave everyone a way out. The strait was never truly closed for long. But it was disrupted enough to raise global insurance rates, to make every shipping company in the world recalculate their routes, and to demonstrate that the narrow geography of the Gulf made any military solution deeply imperfect. What's different now is the technology. In 1987, Iran's most effective weapon in the Gulf was the contact mine, a simple steel sphere that floated in the water and exploded when a ship hit it. Cheap, abundant, effective, and incredibly difficult to sweep. They also had silkworm missiles, French exocets, and speedboats. These were formidable, but they required a certain proximity, a certain exposure. To lay a mine, you had to send a ship into the channel. And when you sent a ship into the channel, the U.S. Army's Little Bird helicopters could find it on a dark night and destroy it. Now, Think about what Iran and its proxies have been deploying since 2019. Precision cruise missiles that can fly for hundreds of kilometers at low altitude and strike a processing facility with pinpoint accuracy. One-way attack drones, essentially cheap flying bombs, that can be launched from a truck bed, fly a pre-programmed route, and hit a tanker or a terminal. Drone boats that look like pieces of debris until they're 50 meters from your hull. Anti-ship ballistic missiles. And an entire proxy network, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, each of which can deploy these weapons without Iran having to take direct responsibility. The threat has not just maintained its intensity over 40 years. It has multiplied. It has spread geographically. And it has gotten dramatically cheaper. A contact mine in the 1980s cost a few $100s. A Houthi one-way attack drone costs perhaps $10,000. A ship, a tanker, a refinery terminal, these things cost hundreds of millions or billions. The economics of asymmetric warfare have never been more favorable to the attacker. You can threaten $50 billion of global energy infrastructure for the price of a used car. And this is what the Abqaiq attack in 2019 proved with absolute clarity. This is what 2 years of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea confirmed. The battlefield is no longer just the water. The battlefield is everything: the pipelines, the liquefaction plants, the loading terminals, the ships at anchor. Every single node in the global energy supply chain that touches this region is now a potential target. There's something else that the 1980s tanker war teaches us, and it's perhaps the most human lesson of all. Wars happen at sea in ways that don't quite register on shore. When a mine explodes under a tanker in the Gulf at 3 a.m, it doesn't make the front page the same way a battle does. When a merchant sailor from the Philippines is killed in the Gulf, not a soldier, not a combatant, just someone trying to earn a living and send money home to his family, his story rarely gets told. The tanker war killed over 100 sailors directly in U.S. Navy operations alone, and many more merchant mariners in the broader conflict. Their names are almost never mentioned. The same is true today. Right now, there are crews on those 200 anchored ships who are sitting in the middle of an international crisis that has nothing to do with them personally. They are the civilian infrastructure of the global economy. They keep everything moving: the oil, the gas, the containers, the cars, the food, the medicine. And when the powerful nations of the world start fighting over the waterway they sail through, these people become invisible. Their fear doesn't get reported. Their waiting doesn't get analyzed. The human cost of closing a strait is measured in barrels and price indices, not in the faces of the people who actually live it. That's worth sitting with for a moment. 38 years separate the morning the Bridgeton hit that mine in the dark waters near Farsi Island and the morning the Maltese flag container ship Safine Prestige was struck by a projectile and abandoned by its crew in the Strait of Hormuz. 38 years. In that time, the world has built more pipelines, created alternative routes, developed technology that was unimaginable in 1987. The global economy has become more interconnected, more resilient in some ways, more fragile in others. The oil market has shifted. New producers have emerged. Renewable energy has begun the long, slow work of changing the energy mix. And yet, 20% of the world's daily oil supply still passes through those 21 miles of water between Iran and Oman. The shipping lanes are still only 2 miles wide in each direction. Iran still controls the northern shore. The IRGC Navy still has speedboats and mines and missiles. The underlying geopolitical tension, Iran's isolation, the Gulf states' fear of Iranian power, the U.S. commitment to keeping energy flowing, Israel's security concerns, none of that has been resolved. It has just been managed, sometimes better and sometimes worse. The tanker war of the 1980s didn't solve the problem of the Strait of Hormuz. It bought time. And time, as it turns out, is not the same as a solution. What's happening now is not a repeat. History doesn't repeat like that, not exactly. The weapons are different, the context is different, the scale is potentially different. But the logic is hauntingly familiar. A regional power using the strait as leverage. The world's oil supply as a hostage. A superpower scrambling to reassemble the architecture of naval protection that worked, more or less, the last time. And somewhere in the Gulf tonight, a captain is sitting in his bridge, radio on, watching the radar, waiting for news from ashore, doing the math on his food and water supply, and wondering if the world is going to figure this out before something much worse happens. He's been here before. Not him personally. But someone exactly like him has sat in exactly that chair and felt exactly that particular kind of dread, the kind that comes from being right in the middle of something enormous that you have no control over and didn't ask to be part of. The last time, eventually, the shooting stopped and the convoys made it through and the tankers moved again and the world's lights stayed on. Eventually. But the strait is still there. It will always be there. And as long as the world depends on what flows through it, someone will always be willing to use it as a weapon. That's the lesson that never changes. And the question, the only real question, is whether the people with the power to change that underlying dependency are paying close enough attention to learn it this time.